Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them, we placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. So I go back to my inventory sheet. I go to column 4. In column 4, if you'll notice, it's headed up, putting out of my mind the wrongs others have done to me. I resolutely look for my own mistakes. What did I do, if anything, to set in motion trains of circumstances, which in turn caused people or institutions to hurt me, and eventually led to my resentment of them for doing so? So I looked at the first name on the sheet, the lady named Barbara. And I said, now, Barbara, or Charlie, you forget what Barbara did. You forget about the 3 divorces. What did you do, if anything, to set this thing in motion? And it didn't take me 2 seconds to be able to say, well, if I hadn't been out there screwing around, I wouldn't have got caught. Now, Joe calls that adultery. I just call it screwing around. If I hadn't been screwing around, I wouldn't have got caught, and she probably wouldn't have filed for divorce in the first place. So screwing around is one of the things I did. This took me just a little bit more to say, if I hadn't have been sneaking around behind her back, lying to her all the time, she might not have filed for divorce in the first place. Continually lying to her. Hell, I reached a point whether I'd rather tell her a lie than the truth if the truth had been easier. I lived a continual life of lying with her. I said, if I hadn't been blowing all of our money on what I thought was so important, rather than taking care of my wife and children like I really should have been, she might not have filed for divorce in the first place. And for the first time, I began to realize why I loved that resentment. Because you see, I'd played it over and over and over and over in my head. And every time I played it over, I made what she did just a little bit worse and what I did just a little bit less. And let me play it long enough, I transfer all blame to her and make myself as pure as the driven snow. If you're a practicing alcoholic, you've got to develop these kind of skills. I don't think you and I could live with ourselves if we had to honestly see what was going on in our life when we were out there drinking. But you see, we never had to honestly look at it because we used that resentment, distorted the picture, transferred all blame to others, and then that let us go ahead and live the kind of life we were wanting to live. And we men went from woman to woman to woman, and you ladies went from man to man to man, and we went from job to job to job. We went from city to city to city. We went from state to state to state, and it was always their damn fault. First time we ever honestly looked at ourselves. And I thought, my God, Charlie, are there any more on here like that? That you yourself set this thing in motion? I looked at the second one on there, the Internal Revenue Service. It didn't take me just a second to say, well, hell, if I hadn't been cheating on my income tax, they wouldn't have caught me. And rather than admit that I'm a thief and a cheat, I managed to transfer and distort that picture and transferred all blame to them and made me as pure as the driven snow. 152 names on my sheet. I never found a one that I didn't do something to them to hurt them. And they retaliated against me, and then I resented them, and I transferred all blame to them. No policeman ever put me in jail for sober driving. No woman ever dragged me through a divorce court because I was a good husband and a good father. Nobody ever beat the hell out of me for keeping my mouth shut. I always made a decision based on self, which later put me in a position to be hurt. Now, in Joe's case with Rose, Joe, what did you do to set that thing off with Rose? Same thing I did, he said. Lying and cheating and stealing and drinking whiskey and committing adultery and laying out late and all that kind of stuff. Hell, no wonder Rose had an affair with another man. Yeah. Now then, I've seen the part I played in step 4. But the book says, where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? There's 4 basic character defects. And that's the only ones that the big book talks about, except for the word inconsideration, which will come up here in a page or 2 later. I now go to the 5th column, and I see, where had I been selfish? Where had I been dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, or inconsiderate? Which of the above character defects caused me to do what I did or caused me to hold on to the old resentment, even though I may have done nothing to cause it? In that deal with Barbara, was I selfish? You bet I was. Hell, I could have cared less about Barbara. Was I dishonest? Sure I was, sneaking around behind her back, lying to her all the time. Was I self-seeking and frightened? Oh, yeah, I was getting pretty close to 40 years old. And I found myself saying, man, if you don't get out there and get some of that stuff, it's going to be too late before long. Fear drives us to do things that end up hurting other people. Was I inconsiderate? Yeah, if I really considered my wife and children first, I wouldn't have been out there doing those things in the first place. How about the Internal Revenue Service? Was I dishonest with the Internal Revenue Service? Sure I was. Was I self-seeking and frightened? You better was. Hell, I needed that money to do what I wanted to do. I was afraid I wouldn't have enough. Why pay it to the Internal Revenue Service if I could keep it for myself? How about Joe? Was Joe selfish in that deal with Rose? Sure he was. Was he dishonest? Sure he was. Was he self-seeking and frightened? Sure he was. Was he inconsiderate? You better bet he was. For the first time, I began to see in that 5th column the kind of personality that I had developed through my years of living a life run on self-will. And when I looked in that 5th column and saw the real truth about me, pretty well made me sick. I always thought I was a pretty good guy. I just drank a little too much. But I began to see that because of my own character defects, that I made decisions based on self, which always placed me in a position to be hurt at a later date. And I began to see in that 5th column that if I don't do something about that, if I continue to stay selfish and dishonest and self-seeking and frightened and inconsiderate, then I'm going to keep right on doing the same old things. Drunk or sober, don't make any difference. I'm going to keep right on hurting people. And they're going to retaliate, and I'm going to resent, and eventually I'm going to get drunk over it. But just think, if I could become just a little less selfish, don't have to get perfect, I never will. If I could become a little less selfish, if I could become a little less dishonest, if I could become a little less self-seeking and frightened, if I could become a little less inconsiderate, maybe I wouldn't be hurting so many people. And maybe they wouldn't retaliate, and maybe I wouldn't have to resent them for doing so. You see, what we're really doing here, we're doing step 4. This is the resentment part of it, and I'm going to ask Joe to put a 4 right up at the top of the page. Now, out in the 5th column, I now see the exact nature of the wrong I'm going to talk to another human being about in step 5. The resentment is the wrong, but the nature of something is what's the truth behind it? What's the inherent characteristic of it? What's at the core of it? Well, my character defect is the exact nature of that wrong. That's what we're going to talk to another human being about. A guy comes to me with a step 5 today. I don't care how many times he stole, whether he stole once or 1,000. What I'm interested in is what's within him that causes that. That's what we're going to have to start working on and change to keep him from doing that in the future. I don't care how many times he committed adultery. What I'm concerned with is what's within him that caused that. Now, is he doing it out of selfishness? Is he doing it out of fear? That's what we're going to have to find out and really talk about in step 5. In the 5th column, I now see the character defects I'm going to become willing to turn loose of in step 6. Knowing that if I continue with that kind of personality, there's no way I'm going to stay sober. In the 5th column, I see the shortcomings I'm going to ask God to take away in step 7. And quite naturally, all the names in my column 1, probably some in yours, but all in mine, were people at institutions I've harmed. And they're going to come off of column 1 and be added to a sheet to be used later on for steps 8 and 9. We get to step 8, the book says we've got the list, we made it when we took step 4. So if I've done this simple little inventory the way the big book says to do it, I've got all the information now I need, resentment-wise, for steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Have you ever seen anything that simple? No. I sure as hell haven't. It just took us years to see it in there, but we finally found it. Now, I hear some of you saying, and we're going to be through here in a minute, but I hear some of you saying, and I hear awful good, I really do. I hear some of you saying, well, Charlie, that's probably right for people that we've harmed them. But how about those that did it to us and we didn't have anything to do with that? How about those that hurt us as kids growing up? The mental abuse, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, and etc. Aren't we justified in having that kind of resentment? And I guess we are if we want to get drunk over it. But you see, a justified resentment blocks you off from the sunlight of the Spirit, just like an unjustified resentment does. Whoever you're resenting are controlling your thinking for you. And you've given them the power to actually kill you. And if you've got a resentment like that in your mind, and you don't want to get rid of it, knowing full well it might get you drunk, for God's sake, put it on this sheet of paper. Put down the name, what they did to you, the part of self that's affected. What did I do? Nothing. But then let's look into the 5th column. Are we using this resentment for some selfish reason? Are we so dishonest with ourselves that we refuse to see the truth behind it? If you've got a resentment in your mind today, it's not true. I'm going to say that again, it's not true. It's partially true. It started with truth. But if you've played it over and over and over, it's distorted and you're not really seeing the truth behind it. Am I so self-seeking and frightened that I'm afraid to face life without that resentment? Now, one of the greatest things to rationalize and justify not doing what we should do or continue to do things we shouldn't do is, I can't help it. It's all their fault. They made me this way. Bull. Bull. It's time for us to start taking responsibility for our own thinking and our own behavior. We can no longer afford to blame these things on other people, because if we do, we're letting other people control the way we think. We're letting them control the way they act. We're letting them control our lives. This lady in the book, she had her resentment against her mother. Hell, she loved it. You know, she used it to justify her lack of education. After all, if Mama hadn't have done that to me, I would have been able to get an education. Bull. She could have gotten an education if she wanted to, bad enough. She used it to justify her marital failure. All Mama's fault. Bull. Mama had nothing to do with that. She even used it to justify her alcoholism. Bull. Mama had nothing to do with her alcoholism. I'll tell you why she became alcoholic. She kept on drinking that whiskey. Yeah. Mama didn't pour it down her throat. You know, we call that today, I think society refers to that as victimization. And we really don't have any place in our program for victimization. Because when you're playing the part of the victim, then they've got you. They're controlling you. And it doesn't make any sense. I don't care what they did to me. It doesn't make any sense to let somebody hurt me 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago and then let them hurt me every day for the rest of my life. I simply don't have to do that. You know, I might even consider the fact that the people that did it to me, not necessarily bad people, they're sick people. And it didn't necessarily just do it to me, they would have done it to anybody in that condition. Maybe I could start a forgiving process. Maybe I could straighten out a relationship with another human being before it's too late. And if nothing else, I always have the ultimate thing to get rid of it. By God, I can pray for them. And that's the hardest thing in the world to do, to pray for one of those suckers that you hate them with a purple passion. But if I pray for them, that doesn't mean I approve of what they did. That doesn't mean I'm going to walk hand in hand with them throughout the rest of my life. What it means is I'm damn tired of letting them make me sick. And I've made a decision to let God direct my thinking. And if they directed, God can't. It's just that simple. We can get rid of those resentments too if we wish to. And if we don't wish to, we're probably using it for some particular reason to rationalize or justify not doing what we should do, or just as importantly, to do things we shouldn't do. Now, tomorrow morning, you guys are going to be the most beautiful people in the world. You're going to go back to wherever you're staying tonight, and you're going to work on these resentments, and tomorrow morning, you're going to be 100% resentment-free. You're going to be the most beautiful people in town tomorrow. Now, the next thing we have to do in our inventory will be fears and sex. And Joe leaned over here a while ago and whispered in my ear, and he said, "Charlie, I've got a headache and I'm tired." He said, "I don't feel like doing sex this afternoon. So how about us getting a good night's rest and we'll have sex on Sunday morning? Is that okay with everybody?" All right. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you. My name is Joe, and I'm an alcoholic. Can you hear me now? Yeah. All right. And it's truly by God's grace and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. And tomorrow, November the 3rd, 1973, tomorrow I'll have 30 years of sobriety. Thank you. I really wish it was only 5. And I have 25 more years to live this good life. But I want to tell you a story this morning about these 3 little boys, about like Don and Charlie and I. They were in the 6th grade, and they were about 22, 23 years old. We have to get the picture. The principal wanted them out of the 6th grade desperately. He tired of looking at them. So he called them in the office and said, "Boys, if you answer these questions I'm going to give you, you can go on to the 7th grade." So they asked Don, said, "Don, what is it that women have 2 of that men like to get their hands on?" And he thought for a long time, and he finally said, "Well, men like to hold women's hands." He said, "Well, that's good. You're in the 7th grade, Don." He looked at Charlie and said, "Now, Charlie, what is it that men have 1 of that women like to get their hands on?" And he thought for a long time, and finally he said, "Well, men have 1 billfold. Women like to get their hands on a man's billfold." So that's good, Charlie. You're in the 7th grade. He looked over at me and said to Joe, "I'm going to ask you a simple question." I said, "God, I hope so. I missed those first 2. The main problem of the alcoholic centers in the mind.
Are you through?
I'm finished.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name's Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 12,422 days today. one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. God, you guys. You guys really, really do look good this morning. It's amazing. Not a resentment left in the whole bunch. Isn't that something? Huh? How many of you went back where you were staying last night and worked on at least one resentment? Could I see your hands, please? Yeah, a lot of you did. How many of you got rid of at least one resentment? Could I see your hands? Okay. How many of you did we give a new resentment to yesterday afternoon? Could I see your hands?
Yeah, pray for us. We need the prayers and you need to practice.
I always like to tell a little story about a young Catholic boy. It was birthday was coming up, and he went to his dad and he said, "Dad, you think it'd be possible for me to get a bicycle for my birthday this year?" And his father said, "Well, no, son, I don't think so." He said, "You got 4 or 5 brothers and sisters, and I can just barely feed you, and there's no way I can afford a bicycle." The little boy said, "Well, what could I do about it?" And his dad said, "Well, why don't you write a letter to God and see what happens? You never know." And the little Catholic boy went into his bedroom and sat down at a desk and got a pencil and a piece of paper, and he began to write, and he said, "Dear Jesus," said, "I'm a little Catholic boy. I'm about 12 years old, and I've never had a bicycle in my entire life." He said, "Oh, crap, that won't work." And he tore that paper up and threw it away and sat there a little while and got another piece of paper and began to write, and he said, "Dear God," he said, "I'm a little Catholic boy, and I'm 12 years old, and I've never had a bicycle before in my life, and I've been going to church." And he said, "Crap, that won't work." And he tore it up and threw it away. And while sitting there looking around, he looked up on the dresser, and there was a statuette of the Virgin up there. And all of a sudden, his eyes lit up, and he jumped up, and he grabbed that statuette and got into his underwear drawer and got out a roll of socks. Put the statuette in that roll of socks and rolled them up real carefully. Put it back in the underwear drawer and covered it up and closed the drawer. He went over and sat down and got his pencil and piece of paper, and he said, "Dear Jesus, if you ever want to see your mama again..." I bet we've got a place for him at one of our tables too, don't you? We spent a lot of time yesterday afternoon in the resentment part of our step 4. And for the first time, for the majority of us, we truthfully looked at our resentments. Always before, we had looked to see what those people had done to us. But for a change, we looked to see that what we had done to other people and how we ourselves set the ball rolling in a majority of the cases. And we found that most of our resentments would stem from the fact that we made a decision based on self sometime in the past. And that decision ended up hurting other people or institutions. They in turn retaliated against us and created pain and suffering for us. Then we in turn, as we played those resentments over and over and over in our head, gradually distorted the picture, transferred all blame to them, and made ourselves as pure as the driven snow. A very, very convenient way to never have to look at the things that we have done to harm other people. So for the first time, we honestly looked at those resentments, and we saw that we ourselves had developed a certain kind of personality through the years that we lived on self-will run riot. And we began to see that we had become very selfish human beings. We began to see where we had become very dishonest human beings, where we had become very self-seeking, frightened of, inconsiderate of other human beings. And we began to see that those things within our character, within our makeup, is a type of personality that caused and created our problems for us. And we began to see if we didn't do something about that old selfishness, that old dishonesty, self-seeking, frightened, inconsiderate character that we had become, we would simply continue to do the same things over and over and over and over. Continue to hurt people, they would retaliate, then we in turn would resent them for doing so. And eventually, of course, the resentment would lead us right back to drinking again. And we kind of summed that up by saying on that particular part of the inventory, we were doing step 4, the resentment part, and we found out in the 5th column that we had now the exact nature of the wrong we would talk to another human being about in step 5. The resentment is the wrong, but the real nature of it was what's within me that caused me to do those things in the first place. We also found that in that 5th column, we had the character defects we're going to become willing to turn loose of in step 6. Also in that 5th column, we had the shortcomings that we're going to ask God to take away in step 7. And then quite naturally, in my case, all the names in column 1, in your case probably part of them, but mine all of them, were people and institutions that I had harmed somewhere in the past. And they would come off of that list and be used then, added on for steps 8 and 9 at a later date. So I think we kind of summed it up by saying that if we would do that inventory on resentments the way the big book says, we would have all the information we would need for steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, resentment-wise. By the same token, when we saw the truth behind those resentments, when we saw what people had been doing to us, how we let them control us and rule us and dominate us through our resentments toward them, those resentments began to look pretty dumb and pretty stupid. They looked awful good in our head, but they looked dumb on paper. And they looked so dumb, about 90% of them automatically begin to disappear when we see what we've been letting people do to us through those resentments. We found that we could take the other real deep-seated resentments that didn't disappear automatically by looking at the truth, and we could pray for those people or those institutions or whatever it might be. And through the prayer, we could become resentment-free, at least to the level that God intended for us to be. We said we couldn't, we could not get rid of those resentments and leave another hole in our head. But that space that the resentments occupied would now have to be occupied with something else. And the only thing that can take the place of the resentments would be the opposite of it. And where our mind used to be filled with resentment, then that portion of our mind is now filled with a little love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill toward our fellow man. We're in much less chance of drinking now than we were when we started the inventory process. So we really had a positive result, a very positive happening as we did that resentment thing. And the thing that really amazes most of us, I think, is we realize that to get the love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill, we didn't have to go anywhere else to find it. We didn't have to read any other books or go to any other fellowships. Because if God dwells within us, then that's been a part of our makeup all along. We just never could use it before. But now that the resentments are gone, those things automatically start coming to the surface. We're now beginning to get a little peace of mind, a little bit of serenity, a little bit of happiness. 1/3 of my store up here has been straightened out. Now this morning we're going to follow that same procedure. We're going to look at our fears, we're going to look at our sexual harms, and we're going to look at harms other than sexual. And we're going to follow the same identical procedure to look at those that we did for the resentments. So the next thing we're going to do is go to page 67, the bottom of the page, and we're going to start on fears. Joe?
Before we do that, Janice Morande, Morande, is she here? Okay, we got your driver's license and credit card here. Don said it was slightly used. Before we go to page 67, let's look at page 18 for a moment. You know, we're not going to, as Charlie said yesterday and for sure today, when people look at their fears, a lot of times they want to psychoanalyze themselves and can't heal a sick mind with a sick mind. and they want to blame it on Mama. Maybe she set him on the potty chair backwards. That's the reason they have all these fears and stuff like that. We're not going to do that. What we're going to do is exactly what Charlie said yesterday, and it says in the business inventory. We're going to find the facts, we're going to face the facts, and then we're going to engage in a process to accept the facts. And remember, it said that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. Spiritual not only means my relationship with God, but my own moral fiber. When that's straightened out, we straighten out mentally and physically. And Dr. Jung told Roland that ideas, emotions, and attitudes were the guiding force of the lives of these people. And on page 18, this little first paragraph tells my whole story in effect. He said, an illness of this sort, and we've come to believe it an illness, involves those of the bowels in a way no other human sickness can. If a person has cancer, all are sorry for him and no one is angry or hurt. But not so with the alcoholic illness. For with it goes annihilation of all things worthwhile in life. It engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents, and anyone can increase the list. In other words, alcoholism is a family illness. If you live with one of us very long, you're going to get affected by it, generally negatively. And I look back in my life today, and I realize that my dad was an alcoholic. He had an obsession to drink. My mother had an obsession to see that he didn't drink. And I grew up in that. Seemed like every time my dad took a drink, my mother had a personality change, just like that. And they fought and fussed a lot about drinking. We left the farming community in Oklahoma and went out to California, didn't fit in too good out there, came back to Tulsa on the wrong side of the tracks, about 3 miles from where Charlie lived. And my dad went to work hauling ice, and in those days he was an ice man, took ice to people's houses. Some of y'all remember that. Back-breaking work 6 days a week, long hours. He had a wife and 5 kids, and that scared me to even think about it. He wasn't making less than minimum wage. There wasn't any minimum wage in those days, hardly any money at all.
Wasn't even any poverty level, was
No, it wasn't any, everybody was poor. Charlie and I talk a lot about it, but, we spell poor with 3 O's. Told Charlie one time we never was poor. We had to live in a tent, but if we'd had the money, we'd have lived in one, I'll tell you that. But my dad worked hard, and my mother let these 5 kids get bigger. And he on Saturday evening, he'd come by the bootlegger, and my Aunt Much was a bootlegger, too. She'd go either way. And that's the way they made their living. He'd buy a pint of whiskey there and bring it home to have a drink. And my mother saw that $1 or so being spent on booze that could be going to feed these 5 kids, so they raised hell with each other. I believe my dad deserved a drink. I really do that. After 6 days of back-breaking work, he ought to have a drink if he wanted one. But she didn't see it that way, and they raised hell with each other. Nothing but fighting all the time. And we know that alcoholism is a progressive illness. It always gets worse. It never gets any better. And I grew up in this. And I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I remember them fussing and fighting and throwing stuff at each other and threatening and whatever. My dad would pull a knife out once in a while and threaten her with it, and she'd throw something at him, and they'd fight. And he eventually got to where he'd pull out a gun and threaten to kill my mother with it from time to time. And I grew up in this, and I saw these things. It scared me. And eventually she had him arrested and took to the Eastern State Hospital and committed him at the criminally insane ward for alcoholism. They didn't have any treatment facilities in those days, in our area anyhow. So they put him in a criminally insane ward, and he was to stay there till he got well. Think about that. And he was there for 3 years and 7 months and 13 days. He went in there about the time I was about 7 or so. And my brother and I used to hitchhike up there and take him a carton of cigarettes, a couple of dollars from time to time. And we'd go up into Building 3 on the 6th floor in the back and see the criminally insane ward. And I saw things back there as a young child that nobody's supposed to see. I mean, nobody's supposed to see what goes on back there. But I saw them. And I began to get a little ideas, emotions, and attitudes which become the guiding force of my life on the way home from up there. And one of the thoughts that came to me one day, without any help from anybody, was like this. I said, if God You know, you got to blame it on somebody, right? If God is going to do this to me and to us, and to hell with him. If I ever get big enough they can't catch me, I'm not going anymore either, and I'll not be asking him for nothing. And that's the way I lived my life for a long time afterwards. And one day, coming back from up there, I said to myself, boy, if it hurts like this to love people, I'm going to quit loving people. It hurts too bad. So I began to push people out of my life. And one day, coming back from up there, a thought came to me. It said, if anything good is going to happen in my life, it's going to happen because I made it that way. Me by myself, it looks like. So I didn't need God, nothing, or nobody. And that's the way I live my life. And if you threatened me in any manner, or I perceived a threat from you in any manner, it was not good for you. I mean, it really wasn't. And for many, many years, even in AA, I thought that was a very brave thoughts on my part. Turns out they're the most fearful thoughts that anybody could possibly have. And I was eaten up with fear, and I didn't know it. And like I said, I lashed out at people. That was the way that I did. And of course, they put you in jail for those things too. Put you in prison for that too, and they did that for me. You know, divorce you for those things too. They did that for me. I didn't have any coping skills, so when I arrived at Alcoholics Anonymous, I had the spiritual knowledge of a 7-year-old boy. I had the coping skills of an 8 or 9-year-old boy, and I had the sexual knowledge of a 12 or 13-year-old boy that I learned off the streets. You think I didn't need an inventory? We'll talk some more about that a little bit later. Definitely needed an inventory to find out what was right and what was wrong for me, because I didn't know. Like I said, my mother was busy letting 5 kids get bigger. She had her hands full washing and cooking and ironing clothes and doing all that stuff, let alone raising any kids. So I was just left to grow up outside, get bigger. And everything that I learned on the streets from people that didn't know any more about it than I did. And so I needed an inventory. But I was fought through with fear. Let's go back now to page 67. Bottom of the page. It said, notice that the word fear is bracketed along alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Miss Jones, the employer, and the wife. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes I'd be in jail, and I say to myself, I'm not like this. This is not really me. I mean, I'm not like this. But I'm still in jail. You do the crime, you do the time, the way that goes, you know. But sometimes we think that fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. Now, we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. We asked ourselves why we had them, and here it was for me. Wasn't it because that self-reliance failed? I was totally a self-reliant individual. Didn't need God, nothing, or nobody. Self-reliance was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse.
Okay, though, that last paragraph that Joe just read gives us basically about the same kind of instructions to look at our fears as we had for resentments, worded a little bit differently, which is Bill's way of doing things. So what we did to avoid any confusion at all is we just made up another little simple inventory form. We called it a review of fears, and it looks almost exactly like the resentment sheet does. It's got 5 columns on it, just like the resentment sheet had. Column 1, who or what do I fear? Column 2, the cause. Column 3, affects my. Column 4, what did I do? And column 5, where had I been? Now, a lot of people say, well, we don't have very much fear. You know, we men tend to think we're tough and we're macho, and we don't have much fear. But we're not talking so much about physical fear as we have those fears that continually run through our minds and control and dominate our thinking for us. We all have fears connected with our marriages. We all have fears connected with our jobs. Certainly we've all got fears connected with our children. We've got fears connected with the Internal Revenue Service. We've got fears connected with the federal government. We've got fears connected with the church. I just sat here and we could name literally hundreds and hundreds of fears that we human beings have. And just like resentments, I didn't think that I had very much fear. Instead, I started making a list of them in column 1. In column 1, it says, I list people, institutions, or principles that I fear. And as I began to fill out that sheet, the next thing you know, just like resentments, I had listed a total of about 8 fears on one sheet. And then I got another sheet, and I listed another 8 fears, and another sheet, and another 8 fears. And when I began to fill out sheet after sheet after sheet after sheet, I began to realize how much fear I really do have. And I don't think any of us will ever realize how much fear we have, how much it controls us and dominates our thinking, until we get them all down on a sheet of paper and see them for the first time in their complete entirety. Now, we've made a decision to let God direct our thinking. And if we've got that many fears, then those things we fear direct our thinking, and God can't. And it's just about that simple. So column 1, I just simply make that list, just like I did with resentments. Column 2, what's the cause of the fear? Now, we're not going to attempt to psychoanalyze ourselves. Like Joe says, I'm not going to say that I'm afraid of the dark because Mother set me on the potty sideways when I was 2 years old. You know, fear is like resentment. We're supposed to have some fear. Fear brings caution. Fear keeps me from getting hurt. Yeah, I'm a little bit afraid of the dark. Why? Well, I don't have headlights and I can't see at night, and that helps me keep from getting hurt. I'm a little bit afraid of heights. Why? I don't have wings and I can't fly, and that brings caution and keeps me from getting hurt. But if those fears should keep me from going outside after dark, if they should keep me from flying in an airplane or riding in an elevator, then I better look at them very, very closely, because they're ruling and dominating my life for me. Column 2 is headed up. What are they going to do to me? Am I going to jail? Am I going to lose something of material value? Am I going to lose face? Will it result in divorce? Will it destroy a personal relationship? Might I lose my job, etc.? Nearly every fear that we have, there's some basic root cause for it. And I find in my own case that most of my fears are centered around usually one of 3 different things. I'm scared to death I'm going to lose something I've already got. I'm scared to death I'm not going to get something I really want. Or I've done something I shouldn't have been doing, and I'm scared to death what they're going to do when they find out about it. Nearly all my fears will center around those particular things. So column 2, I just put down the cause of the fear. Column 3, what part of self is affected? Just like with resentments, I couldn't have a resentment unless there's a threat to one of the basic instincts of life. Same thing with fear. The only time I experience fear is when there's some kind of threat to one of my basic instincts of life. If you threaten my social instinct in any way, it can create fear. If you threaten my security instinct, it creates fear. If you threaten my sex life, it creates fear. And just like I did with resentments, for the first time in my life I learned where anger came from when I looked at resentments. And now in column 3, I learned where fear really does come from. I thought it was just one of those feelings that flitted into your mind. You could do nothing about it. Today I realize fear comes from a threat to one of those basic instincts of life. And if my relationship with God is right, my instincts are under control, You can say and do about anything you want to me, and it's not going to create fear. But by the same token, if my relationship with God's not right, my instincts are not under control, about anything you do or say to me creates fear for me. Same deal that I had with resentments. Absolutely amazed me when I began to see that. Column 4. What did I do? It's like the book says, did we not ourselves set the ball rolling? What did I do, if anything, to set the ball rolling and set in motion trains of circumstances which have led to my being in a position to have the fear? I wouldn't have to be so afraid of the employer if I wasn't always missing work and coming in late. I wouldn't have to be worried about the police department if I'd simply start complying with the law. I wouldn't have to be worried about the Internal Revenue Service if I'd quit cheating on my income tax. I wouldn't have to be worried about what other people think of me if I'd learned to keep my mouth shut once in a while instead of spouting off all the time. Nearly every one of those fears, I myself have done something somewhere in the past to set the ball rolling. If I can't figure out what I've done, I just put nothing or unknown. But in most cases, I can see where I am at fault in that fear, just like I did with resentments. Column 5. Where had I been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, or inconsiderate? If I wasn't so selfish, I wouldn't have to be worried about not getting what I want or losing what I've already got. If I wasn't so dishonest, I wouldn't be lying and cheating and stealing, and I wouldn't have to be worried about what they're going to do whenever they catch me. If I wasn't so self-seeking and frightened in the first place, I wouldn't have to experience so much fear. If I wasn't so inconsiderate of other human beings, I wouldn't be doing things to them that create problems for them that's going to cause them in turn to retaliate against me. Same basic character defects. But if I could become a little bit less selfish, if I could become a little bit less dishonest, if I could become a little less self-seeking and frightened, if I could become a little less inconsiderate of other people, then maybe I wouldn't be doing so many things and I wouldn't have to experience so much fear. At the very least, I'm going to have to do something about these things out there in the 5th column. Because if I stay that way, I'm going to keep right on acting the way I've always done, keep right on doing the same old things I've always done. I'm going to be eaten up with fear, and eventually that fear is going to block me off from the sunlight of the Spirit. And not feeling good, I'm going to start thinking about a way to feel better. And next thing you know, I've convinced myself that it's okay to drink, and I'm drunk all over again. Fear does exactly the same thing to us that resentments do. So we treat them the same way. Also, this is a part of step 4. This is the fears part. So we'll put a little 4 up here on the top of the sheet. In the 5th column now, I see the exact nature of the wrong that I'm going to talk about in step 5. The fear is what blocks me off from God, but we're going to look at the exact nature of it, what's within me that causes it in the first place. In the 5th column, I see the character defects I'm going to be willing to turn loose of in step 6. In the 5th column, I'm going to see the shortcomings I'm going to ask God to take away in step 7. And quite naturally, some of the names in column 1 are going to be people and institutions that I've harmed, and I'm scared to death what they're going to do whenever they catch me. So they're going to come off of column 1, and they'll be added to the sheet to be used later on for steps 8 and 9. And when I'm through with that little sheet, then I've got all the information I need for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, fears-wise. Works just exactly like the resentment sheet does. And one of the things that really amazed me as I filled out the fear sheet is I began to see many of the same names appearing on the fear sheet that I had on the resentment sheet. Barbara was on the resentment sheet. She was also on the fear sheet. I'm still a little bit afraid of that lady today. If she ever finds out everything I was doing 36 years ago, she'll probably file for divorce again. I don't know. I resented the police department, and I had the police department on the fears list also. I resented the Internal Revenue Service, and I had the Internal Revenue Service on the fear sheet too. I had never tied that together in my head before, how closely these resentments and these fears really do run together. Absolutely amaze me. Now, if you think resentments look dumb, wait till you get your fears down on this paper and follow those things all the way across that sheet. They look awful good in your head, but you get them on paper and they look double dumb. They just look plumb stupid on paper. And once again, we alcoholics don't like to appear dumb. We fancy ourselves as reasonably intelligent people. And we see the stupidity behind these fears. And we see how much we'll let them control and dominate our lives for us. That looks so dumb, about 95% of them are going to automatically start disappearing when we see the truth behind them. You see, we've never seen the truth behind them before. We've only looked at the fears before, and we've never seen the real truth behind them. When we see that, they do look pretty stupid. There might be 3, 4, or 5, though, that are embedded so deeply that we're going to have a little extra help to get rid of those too. So we now come to the second prayer in the big book in step 4, Joe.
He said, perhaps there's a better way. We think so. But we're now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. See, I didn't trust God and I didn't rely upon God. I relied upon myself. So I didn't have any God in my life. No wonder I was fearful. But now things are different. I've done the third step. I'm trying to rely upon God. We trust our infinite God rather than our finite selves. We're in the world to play the role He assigns. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think that spirituality is the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it's the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. Here's the prayer. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. And at once, we commence to outgrow fear. My first sponsor, Franklin Williams, bless his heart, he said the two most important things about prayer, absolutely the most important things about prayer. One was to start, and the other was to continue. And as I look back over my life, these 30 years, every time I pray, I change just hardly noticeable to anybody, including myself. And next time I pray, just another little buzz, and the next time just another little bit. And as time goes by, there's a major change. I'm not what I used to be, thank God. I'm not that anymore. I am trying to become that which God intends for me to be. And I'm no longer do I have the fears that I used to have. And I don't react to people like I used to react. I see people now in the grocery lines and here and there, driving on the freeway. They're in a hurry to cut in front of you or to get ahead of you. And all. I know what's wrong with them. Hell, I used to be just like them. Man, they're full of fear. They're afraid they're not going to get something. You know, they're going to rush in front of you and try to cut you off, take their life in their hands as well as yours, and try to, seemingly, just so they can gain 50 feet, you know, split second. But I don't do that anymore. My wife taught me one of those things about that. One time I was cutting around in traffic, and I was telling what these people ought to do. She said, Joe, what you need to do is just drive one car. Hell, I was trying to drive everybody's car. Just drive one. Be a lot more peaceful with it. Anyhow, pray and continue to pray, and we'll change.
We hear always about the promises on page 83 and 84 in the big book. We never hear about the promises that are spread throughout the entire book. Joe just read one of the greatest promises to be found anywhere in the book. It said we ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be instead. At once, we commence to outgrow that fear. You can take these deep-seated fears just like we did with those deep-seated resentments. And when they come into our head, we ask God to remove that particular fear, whatever it might be, and ask him to direct our attention to what he would have us be instead. And at once, we commence to outgrow that fear. This thing really does work. It always amazes me when I see it. We did one of these big book study up in New York City a few years ago. There was a woman came up to me and said, I've got one of my greatest fears is this subway system up here. She said, I don't have a car and can't drive one up here anyhow in Manhattan hardly, and can hardly get around on a bus. And she said, it's almost impossible for me to go anywhere. I'm scared to death to get on that subway system. What can I do about it? And I said, well, you do what the big book says to do. You ask God to remove that fear and direct your attention to what he would have you be instead. And I said, you'll eventually outgrow that fear. If it don't work the first day, you do it again and again and again and again. And I gave her my name and address, and I said, call me in about 30 days and let me know how it comes out. In about a week, she called me. And she said, I'm riding that damn subway system all over this town up here. The thing really, really, really does work. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, if 95% of these fears disappear because they look so stupid, if the other 5% can be removed through prayer, then that means this file cabinet up here in my store has now been emptied out. The damaged and unsaleable goods caused fear has disappeared, at least to the level that God intends for it to be. And once again, God can't leave another hole in my head. I got enough of those already. If the fear disappears, it has to be replaced with something else. And the only thing that can replace it will be the opposite of it. And where my mind used to be filled with fear, now then that portion of my mind is filled with faith and courage, the exact opposite of the fear. And I'm allowed to do many, many things that I was always afraid to do before. And just as importantly, I'm allowed to quit doing some of the things that I was afraid to quit doing before. This thing really works. And again, I didn't have to go to any other fellowships. I didn't have to read any other books to get faith and courage. If God dwells within me and my book says he does, then that's always been a part of my makeup. I just never could use it before. In my chase for money, power, prestige, sex, what I thought were the good things of life, those things had to be repressed to let me operate on the level I wanted to operate on, and fear just literally ate me up and ruled and controlled and dominated. And I don't think any of us will ever see the extent that fear does this to us until we get this stuff on paper and take a look at it. Now, also, just like with resentments, if you've got a fear that you don't want to get rid of, then we need to get it on this paper and look at it very carefully, knowing full well that it might get you drunk. If you don't want to get rid of it, then we need to look at it very carefully, because we're using it probably like a resentment for rationalization and justification to not do things we really ought to do, or just as importantly, to do things that we really shouldn't be doing. Let me give you, for instance, how many of you in here would like to go back to school and finish your education? Could I see your hands, please? Be honest with me now. A whole bunch of you would like to. I'm going to ask you another question. Please be honest. How many of you really intend to do that? Could I see your hands? Oh, not near as many hands. Well, why not? Nothing in the world but fear. Fear that we can't measure up. Fear of failure. Fear of hard work. Keeps us from doing things many times we really would like to do. Just as importantly, it can keep us doing things we shouldn't be doing too. So if we got one of those, let's get it on here and look at it. Let's see what we're doing with it. Let's see what we're using it for. All my life, I've loved to work with my hands. And I always wanted to build a set of kitchen cabinets. But I never would do that because I knew there would be a lot of mistakes. They wouldn't look very good. People would laugh at it, and I would be embarrassed by it. One time, after having worked this program for several years, I finally decided I was going to build a set of kitchen cabinets. Now, they don't look very good. There's a lot of mistakes in them. People laugh at them, but I don't give a damn anymore, see? I don't have that fear anymore. It's amazing what fear does to us and how it controls us and rules us.
I had this little fellow, his name was Todd, and it's been about 15 years ago now, but Todd was unemployed and unemployable. He couldn't keep a job. I said, Todd, what are you going to do with your life now that you're sober? He said, well, what would you like to do? I asked him. He said, I'd like to be an engineer. And I said, well, why don't you go back to school and become an engineer? He said, Joe, I don't even have a high school education. I said, well, you can get a GED and then you can start there. He said, do you have any idea how long it would take me to get my education that way? And how old I'll be when that happens? I said, do you have any idea how old you're going to be anyhow? Todd got his GED. He went to Tulsa Junior College, got on the Dean's Honor Roll, got a scholastic scholarship to the University of Tulsa. He is now a full-fledged engineer. He's living out in Modesto, and he's married and doing real good. All because of that. And he called me last fall, and he said he had one more winter of schooling, and he would be a full-fledged engineer. It's been almost 15 years ago now. It's what you can do if you want to.
Okay, now 2/3 of my store has been straightened up. I got rid of resentments. They were replaced with love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. I got rid of fear. That's replaced with faith and courage. But this storeroom back here in the back of my store that was filled with guilt and remorse associated with the people I've hurt in the past, we haven't done anything about that yet. And God can't get in that storeroom either because it's already full. He's very definitely blocked out by the guilt and the remorse associated with those harms in the past. So if I want God to direct my entire thinking, then I'm going to have to do something about the guilt and remorse also. And it seems as though that we human beings hurt people in the sexual area faster than we do in any other way. And it seems as though we probably have as much guilt and remorse, or even more so, associated with those things than we do with any other of the things that we do that's wrong. And there's probably some reasoning behind that. You know, the other animals here on earth, they have a sex urge just like we do, so that they can and will reproduce themselves. But the difference in their sex life and our sex life is they don't have this thing called self-will. You know, when it comes time for them to reproduce themselves through the sexual act, God usually signifies that by some physical change in the female of the species. The male senses that change, prepares himself, the two join together, and it's kind of like bang, bang, thank you, ma'am. And when it's over with, they normally go their separate ways. Not always, but normally they do. You see, they didn't think about sex before having it, because they don't have this self-will thing that we've got. Usually they can't even decide who they're going to have sex with. In most cases, they can't decide whether they're going to have it with one or more sexual partners. They can't even decide how many times they're going to have sex in the majority of the cases. And they can't even decide what position they're going to have it in. Therefore, you see very few sexual problems amongst the other animals here on earth. I've never seen a cow on a psychiatrist's couch yet talking about sexual dysfunction. They just don't have those kind of problems because they're not emotionally involved with it. But we human beings are a little bit different. You see, God gives us self-will. And He lets us have sex anytime we want to. We can do it any day of the year that we wish to. We can decide who we're going to have sex with. We can decide whether we're going to have sex with one or more sexual partners. We can even decide how many times we're going to do sex, providing we're physically capable of doing so. And we can even decide what position we're going to do it in. They tell me there's something like 64 different positions a human being can have sex in. I have no idea what they are. I only found 3 in my lifetime. And 2 of those damn near killed me. I'm not sure I'm going back to them. So what we're going to do for just a few minutes this morning is we're going to look at not so much how we do sex, but as to how we think about sex. Because how we think about it determines what we're going to do in that area, and that determines whether we're going to end up hurting other people or not, and that determines whether they're going to retaliate against us, and then we're going to have the fear and the guilt and the remorse and the resentment that goes along with that. And we're going to treat the sex thing just exactly like we did resentments and just like we did fears. At the bottom of page 68, he says, now about sex. Many of us needed an overhauling there. Now, you older fellows, don't get your hopes up. We're talking about mental, not so much physical. But above all, we tried to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get way off the track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cry that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity of procreation. I've heard them all my life. They're the ones that say sex is a dirty thing. You ought to do it at one time in one position with one person only. And the only reason to do it is to reproduce yourself. And if you enjoy it, it's a sinful thing. I've heard them as far back as I can remember. They are to the extremes on one side. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think we do not have enough of it or that it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere, and you hear them today. They're the ones that say you ought to be able to have sex anytime you want to, anywhere you want to, with as many people as you want to. You ought to be able to enjoy it every time, and if you don't, there must be something wrong with you. Maybe they call that the sexual revolution. Main thing I see wrong with it happened about 15 years too late for me to participate in it. I know that. One school would allow man no flavor for his fare, and the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. I just love the way Bill Wilson writes. He said, we want to stay out of this controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? And I read that last statement with great relief, because I knew this book was getting ready to condemn me for what I had been in the past. I knew it was getting ready to tell me what I was going to have to do in the future, and I'd already made up my mind that I wasn't going to pay any attention to it at all. And I'm glad to find out we're not going to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We simply are not going to get into that question, period. This book is meant to be helpful to anybody, anywhere, anytime. And if we start trying to tell people how they're going to have to conduct their sex life, then certainly we're going to start alienating people. And besides that, what's sexually acceptable in one part of the world may not be acceptable at all in another part of the world. So we're not going to get into that question, period. What we are going to do is see a way to look at our own past sex life. See if perhaps we've harmed some other people in that area. See if we might not be able to shape a new sex life for the future, where we can still engage in it and enjoy it yet at the same time not harm other people. And basically that's all we're after in this thing.
I don't want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. I certainly did an overhauling in that area myself when I arrived in Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to do exactly what we've been doing in the resentment and fear areas. We're simply going to find the facts. We're going to face the facts, and we engage in the process to accept the facts. And Dr. Jung again told Roland, ideas, emotions, and attitudes, and that's what we're looking at here, ideas, emotions, and attitudes about sex. That's all we're trying to find. And the first time I got married and went out, and about 2 years later I went out on my wife, and the next day I woke up and boy, I felt bad. I mean, I really felt bad. I didn't know you were supposed to feel bad. Nobody told me that, and I felt real bad. The next time though, it wasn't quite as bad as the first time, and the next time it wasn't quite as bad as that time, and as time went by it got to where it didn't hurt at all. And that's the thing with principles, compromising of principles. See, if you don't have any principles to live by, ultimately you don't have any reasons to live. And that's why I found myself in the end of my drinking career. I had become everything I detested in a human being and compromised every principle known to man and God by the time I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. Certainly I needed to look into this sexual situation to find out what was right and what was wrong for me. I remember when I was about 12, 13 years old, more like 12, I went to my mom. My dad had got out of the nut house, and he was living in California now, and I couldn't talk to him. So I went to my mom. I said, Mom, I've been thinking about sex. It scared the heck out of her. Oh, my God, Benny Joe. She said, that's a dirty, filthy, rotten thing to think about, and you ought to save it for the one you love. That's what she said. And she also said the only reason you're to have sex is to have children. Well, she had 5 children. I figured this out pretty quick. I said, no wonder my dad was in the nut house. But somehow I didn't believe that. Somehow I just didn't believe that. And we had sex education when I went to school, too, except they call it recess. And in West Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a bunch of wise, intelligent, experienced men and women who were about 15 or 16 years old. And they were more than happy to share with me everything they knew about these things. And some of them guys told me what they were going out with 2 or 3 different women a night.
They stood on the street corner in front of the Jenkins Cafe, didn't they, Joe?
Yeah, didn't we, Charlie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Older guys like him telling me all about it. And they told me, and they said 3 or 4 different women a night, they said. And my eyes got about that big around. I like that idea. And some of them was going out with 2 or 3 different women and doing sex 8 or 10 times a night. And my eyes got that big around. Now, the fallacy of all this is this. I'm sober in Alcoholics Anonymous for 2 or 3 years before I figured out they were lying to me. Or at least I hope they were lying to me. Because I never could live up to those ideals. But I tried to. So you see, you think that I didn't need to do an inventory about sexual situation in my life? Certainly I did. How many of you got your sexual information somewhat like I did? Yeah, we need an inventory in that area for sure. And the way we're going to describe to do it is the best way I know of. And I did that. And I shaped a sane and sound ideal for my sex life. By the way, I haven't been divorced in 27 years. Haven't been necessary to take a divorce in 27 years.
When's the first time you had sex?
Oh, yeah, he wants to tell me the first time I had sex. He likes this. I was selfish, I was dishonest, I was self-seeking, frightened, inconsiderate, and I was also alone. Would anybody like to have a consultation with me about? No, I don't think so.
That's why he's wearing glasses today, too. Every time we say that, we look out there and about a dozen of you guys whip your glasses off and put them in your pocket. Okay. Next paragraph gives us the same set of instructions to review our sex life as we had for resentments, just worded a little bit differently is all. So again, to avoid any confusion, we made us another little inventory form. And we called it a review of our sex conduct. And the next paragraph says we reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Of course, that's column 5. Whom had we hurt? Column 1. Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Column 4. Were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it. So we're just going to do the same thing that we did with the other resentments and fears. Column 1, who did I hurt? I doubt if anybody in this room this morning ever hurt anybody in the sexual area that we don't know just exactly who that was. That seems to be a form of knowledge that we all have. There may be some questions sometimes as to what do we do to hurt people in the sexual area. Of course, we hurt them in many different ways. You know, if I'm in a married relationship and I go outside of my marriage and have sex out there, and my spouse finds out about it, then certainly I've created a problem for her. If I have children in my home, that same little sexual escapade is going to create a problem for my children too. If the lady I had sex with out there, if it becomes common knowledge, I've hurt her also. And if she has a husband and children, I've hurt them too. You know, one sex act can hurt several different people. Sometimes I think we hurt people in the sexual area simply by demanding more than our fair share of it. Maybe our partner isn't too keen about having sex every time we want to. Rather than consider their needs and wants, we selfishly demand that they do those things with us when they really don't want to. Surely we create a problem for them, if not physically, at least emotionally. Sometimes we hurt people in the sexual area by demanding they do things with us sexually they really don't want to do. And again, rather than consider their needs and wants, we selfishly demand those things. Surely we hurt them, if not physically, at least emotionally. Well, I think sometimes we hurt people in the sexual area simply by withholding sex. You know, maybe we're not too keen about having sex every time our partner wants to. And sometimes, rather than consider their needs and wants and desires, we selfishly withhold when perhaps we should give in a little more often. Many ways we hurt people in the sexual area. I think we all know what they are, and I think we all know who we've hurt. Column 1, we just simply make a list of those we've hurt in the sexual by our sexual conduct of the past.